So, picture Moscow, 1989. The Cold War is starting to wind down, but things are still pretty unique. In a very important meeting, a Soviet official, someone who really holds sway, looks across the table at the Pepsi executives, and then he drops this bombshell. We'll give you 17 submarines and 3 warships as payment for your soda. The Pepsi folks, they're just frozen. You can see the thought bubble. Did he really just say that? This wasn't a deal about military might or secret intelligence. It was a straight-up business negotiation to sell Pepsi in the Soviet Union. But the Soviet side, in all seriousness, puts 20 military vessels on the table. We're talking 17 submarines, a frigate, a cruiser, and a destroyer. The whole package was worth around $3 billion. Let that sink in. The Soviet Union, one of the 2 biggest superpowers on the planet, was offering to pay a soft drink company with actual warships. The Pepsi people are just looking at each other, silent. This isn't how business is supposed to work. Corporations don't just own navies. Private companies don't negotiate for submarines. But here's the real kicker. The Soviet Union was desperate to have Pepsi. The Soviet people absolutely loved it. Pepsi had actually been sold there for years, but the problem was the Soviets couldn't pay with regular money. Their currency, the ruble, was basically worthless outside of their country. No foreign bank would touch it. And even worse, the USSR was running out of the one thing they'd been using to pay Pepsi for the past 17 years. We'll get to that in a bit. But right then, in that Moscow conference room, the Pepsi executives were staring at a deal that sounded like a complete joke. 20 warships for cola. How did a simple beverage company end up in a room discussing submarines with Soviet military brass? This was, without a doubt, the greatest marketing play of the entire 20th century. A strategy so out there, so unconventional, it made Pepsi the only American brand the Soviet Union would even do business with. And it all started with one man who saw an opportunity that nobody else even noticed. Let's rewind a bit to Moscow in 1959. Imagine this. An American vice president is shaking hands with the leader of the Soviet Union, and he hands him a cup of Pepsi. And that simple moment was about to change history. That vice president was Richard Nixon. He was at the American National Exhibition in Moscow, which was basically a big showcase of American technology, culture, and products. Now, the Cold War was in full swing. The US and the Soviet Union were, to put it mildly, not fans of each other. There were nuclear weapons, propaganda wars, and constant threats. But Nixon was there for diplomacy, sort of. He was walking through the exhibition with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader. They stopped at the Pepsi booth. Nixon saw an opening. He picked up a cup of Pepsi and offered it to Khrushchev. The Soviet leader eyed it suspiciously. This was American capitalism in a cup, everything the USSR stood against. But he took a sip anyway, and as he did, cameras flashed. Photographers were everywhere, capturing the exact moment. Nikita Khrushchev, the communist leader of the Soviet Union, drinking American Pepsi. It was a massive propaganda victory for the United States. Pepsi, out of nowhere, became the symbol of American influence. And the person who made all of this happen? His name was Donald Kendall. He wasn't the vice president. He was actually the head of Pepsi's international division. He was the mastermind behind this whole setup. Kendall convinced Nixon to bring Pepsi to that exhibition and to offer a drink to Khrushchev. He convinced him that a soda could actually be a tool for diplomacy, and it worked like a charm.
After that iconic photo, Khrushchev agreed to let Pepsi sell in the Soviet Union, and on an exclusive basis. No Coca-Cola, no other American brands, just Pepsi. Kendall had pulled off the biggest marketing stunt in history. He turned a simple bottle of soda into a powerful geopolitical tool. Pepsi became the very first American consumer product ever sold in the USSR. They set up bottling plants, got their drinks to people all across the Soviet states, reaching an incredible 280 million consumers that Coca-Cola couldn't even dream of touching. But there was one gigantic problem. The Soviet Union couldn't actually pay. The ruble was useless outside their borders, and Pepsi needed dollars. The Soviets simply didn't have them. So think about this. You've just secured a monopoly in a market of 280 million people, but your customers literally can't pay you. What do? This is where it gets really interesting. If this mind-bending story is grabbing you, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. It really helps us keep making content like this for awesome viewers like you. So Kendall's solution to this impossible payment problem was so creative, so unlike anything anyone in corporate America had ever thought of, that it totally changed the game. Fast forward to 1972. Donald Kendall, the same guy, is back in Moscow, and he's proposed what might be the most un-American business deal you can imagine: getting paid in vodka. Not dollars, not gold, but actual vodka. Specifically Stolichnaya vodka, which was the Soviet Union's most famous export and, let's be honest, probably the only thing Russians loved more than waiting in bread lines back then. Think about that for a second. An American capitalist company is agreeing to be paid in alcohol by the communists during the height of the Cold War. The irony is almost unbelievable. But Kendall saw the logic. The Soviets couldn't pay with rubles, and they didn't have dollars, but they did have vodka, and they had it in endless supply. Because if there's one thing the Soviet Union excelled at, besides propaganda and long, brutal winters, it was producing vodka. Russia has been making vodka for centuries. It's their national drink, a huge part of their cultural identity. It was seen as the solution to every problem, from celebrating big wins to just getting through tough times. And Stolichnaya was considered a premium, high-quality vodka that actually sold really well in the West. So here's the brilliant plan Kendall cooked up. Pepsi would ship their soda syrup to the Soviet Union. The Soviets would bottle it, sell it, and make money from it within their own country. But instead of paying Pepsi in those worthless rubles, they would pay them in Stolichnaya vodka. Pepsi would then take that vodka, ship it back to the United States, sell it to American distributors, and then they'd get real dollars. It was basically a giant international barter deal, the oldest form of trading known to humankind, and Kendall had just figured out how to make it work on a massive global scale. The Soviets, they agreed immediately, of course. Why wouldn't they? They got to have Pepsi, an incredibly popular American product, without spending a single dollar. They just had to hand over vodka, something they produced in quantities that would probably make most countries worry about their citizens' liver health. The deal was signed, and Pepsi became the biggest importer of Russian vodka in the United States. For 17 years, this system worked perfectly. Pepsi shipped their syrup, got their vodka, sold it, and made a profit. But now you're probably thinking, wait a minute, if vodka was the solution, why did we start this whole story with warships? Well, it turns out that even when you have a seemingly perfect system, the Soviet Union, being the, well, let's just say unique economic machine it was, managed to mess up even the simplest trade deal. The reason the warships came into play is that after 17 years, the Soviet system, which was largely based on 5-year plans that never quite worked out, eventually ran out of things to barter, even vodka. Let's break down exactly what happened next. It's still Moscow, 1989, and this is where we get to the absolutely mind-boggling part. Pepsi has just agreed to accept 17 submarines and 3 warships as payment for soda. The Pepsi executives in that room, they actually said yes. A beverage company was about to become a naval power.
The Soviet officials, you can imagine, were smiling. They started pulling out all the paperwork, contracts, transfer documents, legal papers that would officially move 20 military vessels from the Soviet Navy into the hands of Pepsi Cola. This was actually happening. The executive who was leading the negotiation signed his name on the dotted line, then another signature, and another. Each one of those signatures made this completely absurd transaction more and more real. Just think about what was being signed at that very moment. This wasn't a normal business contract. It wasn't a supply agreement. It was a document transferring actual military submarines from a global superpower to a soda company. The Soviet representative then countersigned, stamped the documents, making it official, legal, and absolutely binding. Pepsi now officially owned 17 submarines, 1 frigate, 1 cruiser, and 1 destroyer. The total value? A cool $3 billion. A beverage company had just become the 6th largest military power on Earth. They had more submarines than Canada, more warships than Sweden, and more naval firepower than most developed nations. And all of this because the Soviet Union couldn't pay with regular money. Donald Kendall, the CEO who had started this whole Soviet adventure back in 1959, was the one who gave the final approval for this deal. He was in that conference room, he heard the proposal, and he made the decision. And of course, he said yes. He'd been making impossible deals with the USSR for 3 decades. This was just the latest, craziest one. Not long after those contracts were signed, Kendall met with Brent Scowcroft, who was the U.S. National Security Advisor at the time. Scowcroft was understandably concerned, probably a little confused, and maybe even a bit alarmed.
A private American company had just acquired Soviet military vessels. Did Kendall understand what that really meant? Kendall, being the shrewd businessman he was, just leaned back, smiled, and delivered one of the most legendary lines in business history. He said, and I quote, "I'm disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are." Stop and think about that for a second. The US government had spent decades and trillions of dollars trying to weaken the Soviet Union's military power through arms negotiations, treaties, and constant diplomatic pressure. And Kendall, with a few shrewd deals involving soft drinks, had effectively removed 20 warships from their inventory, not through politics, but through cola sales. It was, without a doubt, the most capitalist victory of the entire Cold War. A beverage executive had outsmarted two global superpowers and made his company a significant geopolitical force. He proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a nuclear missile, it's a soft drink and a very good negotiator. But now came the really big question. Pepsi owned 17 submarines. What on earth do you actually do with 17 submarines? So, what does the sixth largest naval power in the world do with its newly acquired fleet? The answer is surprisingly simple. They sell it immediately. Pepsi had absolutely zero interest in operating submarines. They were a beverage company, not a military contractor. The ships were just assets, steel, metal, value. And Pepsi knew exactly what to do with assets. Almost as soon as the deal was finalized, Pepsi contacted a Norwegian company called Akram Industries. They were specialists in breaking down old ships and selling them for scrap. Pepsi made them an offer for all 20 ships, the entire fleet. Akram Industries agreed. The submarines and warships were then towed to Norway, docked at shipbreaking facilities, and systematically taken apart, piece by piece. The steel was sold, the metal was recycled, and all the usable components were salvaged and sold to manufacturers. Pepsi got paid. Real money. Actual dollars. Not vodka, not submarines, but cold, hard cash. The entire process, from when Pepsi received the ships to when they sold them for scrap, took less than a year. For a brief, incredible moment, Pepsi was the sixth largest naval power on Earth. And then they sold it all off and went right back to being a soda company. But here's the most important part. It all worked. The Soviets got their Pepsi. Pepsi got their money. A beverage company had pulled off one of the strangest, most unbelievable business deals in history, and they made billions doing it. Donald Kendall proved something profound that day. You don't always need military power to win. Sometimes all you need is creativity, a willingness to negotiate with an open mind, and the courage to accept submarines as payment.
If you loved hearing about this incredible true story, please subscribe for more amazing tales like this.